So did you fly on Swiss out to Ghana or somebody else?
To Geneva, I went to via Delta, and then British Airways down from London to Ghana, and then on United today.
So you were trotting around the globe. How much time do you spend on the road? How much time do you spend in Brooklyn?
I would probably say 60-40. I mean, it can vary. This year, I mean, to be honest, before I had my daughter and before the pandemic, I have a 6-month-old. But before then, I could be on the road for months on end. Like, you take this week, I probably would have stayed in Europe because I have to be back there next week. So I probably would have just stayed with friends, worked remotely, and
Yeah,
as you do. This time it feels like, all my trips are very quick because I'm keen to get back to New York.
yeah.
But also my wife and I have been able to make it work where, because she can work remotely with her job, that we've been able to do a few trips together. So we went back to Australia for a month, all of March, for instance. We were
Is
all
your
back
wife
there,
Australian
which
as
was fun.
well?
She's actually originally from China, but she moved here when she was 18 for college, and then studied here and worked in New York. So we met here in New York, actually.
Yeah, that's great. And so how's your daughter doing? 6 months old.
She's good. She's good. Very grateful to our in-laws who have recently arrived, which is why I planned this trip around it. But no, she's good. She's just started eating solid. She just had a 6-month shot, so
That's great.
she's gone well.
That's really good. Well, three of my five grandchildren live across the street from me, and the last 15 years, my wife Jeannie and I have been doing a lot of childcare, and we both work from our home as well, so we're able to slide scheduling around, and it's
Well,
good. So
that's
this daughter
good.
of yours is going to save your life because she's going to keep you off the road a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Although I would have to say, because our parents, I mean, our family's global, right? So because my parents live on the other side of the world, we're all going to Greece next month for
Of
the
course,
summer.
well,
So,
you're going to have to travel to
so
see them. Well, my daughter lived in Finland.
exactly.
Yeah, I get that routine because my oldest child, Jessica, lived in Finland and had her kids there, and they lived in Scandinavia for 20 years. So, I understand the long distance visits.
Yeah,
Good. Well,
exactly.
hey, let me
So, yeah.
introduce you properly. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and we go live on YouTube, and then this can be found all sorts of places where podcasts show up. And today, my guest is policy entrepreneur, author, and co-founder of Global Citizen, Michael Sheldrick. And Michael is the author of a book which I have just finished reading called From Ideas to Impact, a playbook uh, for influencing and implementing change in a divided world. And Michael, I just want to show you um, one thing here. I don't know if you can see how dog-eared your book is.
Wow.
Okay, so
Wow.
when I said I read it, I'm talking read it, not
You
skimming.
did.
And I have
Wow.
many quotes marked that I want to go through today and really dive into and talk with you about. So, um, first of all, let me just ask you about yourself. I mean, I've got all the PR stuff here, and I've read the back of the book. Let's talk briefly about your career because it's not your usual career. You involved with public policy, you're involved with bringing change, environmentalism, all sorts of things. You just got back from Ghana. Just take a minute and give me the pitch about who you are and what you do. And then the rest of the time, I want to talk about the ideas in your book. And by the way, this is a good book. I really enjoyed reading it. I learned a lot. Anybody who wants to
Thank you.
change anything in this world, here's your handbook. No excuses now. You've got the book on how to do it. From Ideas to Impact, a playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world. And it really well put together. So first of all, congratulations. And we're going to dive into
Thank
the
you,
book. But
Frank.
tell
Thank
it,
you.
let's pretend we're seated next to each other on an airplane and you're foolish enough to have a conversation with me and not put your earbuds in. And I say, what do you do for a living?
Well, Frank, really appreciate it. So as I mentioned in the book, I'm a policy entrepreneur, and policy can seem like one of those words which is abstract, which is vague. But
Yeah.
the point I make in the book is policy is really about human beings. It's both
Mm.
in terms of the people it impacts, it's all around us, but also it's in terms of the people who actually shape policy. And that
Yeah.
extends far beyond people in government. It can be cultural icons like Taylor Swift, business leaders, and everyday citizens. But how I got involved in changing policy for good is my story is, if I cast myself back 20 or so years ago when I was in high school, started high school, first year of high school, was ranked bottom of the class, right? I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't great at sport, which in Australia, by the way, where I was brought up, is kind of like blasphemy if you're not great at
Hmm.
sport. But I wasn't great at academics until one day this teacher, for whatever reason, saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. He said, I
Mm.
think you can be number one by the end of the year, but you've got to work hard. And because of that teacher, because of the attention he gave me, because of the difference he made in my life, I went
Mm.
from bottom of the class to top of the class. 4 years
Mm.
later, finished high school, got into law school. Suddenly people are like, wow, you're so smart, you're so intelligent. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I remember what it was like to feel like lazy, stupid, a loser. That's
Mm.
what people said of me. And I remember the difference teacher made in my life. And I
Mm.
became acutely aware that around the world, there were millions of children that maybe they didn't have access to a great teacher, or maybe they didn't have access to healthcare and died before the age of 5, so they didn't even make it into school. But essentially, it was this injustice that millions of children would never achieve their potential
Mm.
because of something as basic as access to great teachers. And so originally how I got involved had nothing to do with policy, right? As many people, some even listening to this call, you just want to make a difference. I thought, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to donate to charity. So it turned out one of the few things I was good at, one of my superpowers in the book, and you probably, sorry, in my life, but you probably
Yeah.
picked this up in the book, was I had the ability to ask people for stuff for free, right?
Mm.
So I went around shopping center, got things like vouchers, got things like free coffee, and I did a quiz night at my old school, and we basically were able to raise $1,000 to build schools in countries like Papua New Guinea. And in my summers and winters, when I had the chance to visit these schools, I would be like, wow, okay, it's amazing. This funding helped build bricks and mortar, but who's paying the teachers? Who's putting
Mm.
meals on the table? Some of the kids that go to these schools, that's the only meal they were having a
Sure.
day. And then I thought, wow, you then replicate that out across all countries around the world. No amount of charity night, gala dinners, quiz nights is going to raise the
Yeah.
billions needed to end extreme poverty. It's a $100 billion a year poverty question. And so that's where I got interested in policy, because I was like, government decisions on trade, government decisions on debt, government decisions when it comes to foreign aid or development assistance
Mm.
can play a big role. And I guess coming back to university, it was right on the cusp of social media coming out, and we pioneered approach utilizing social media, popular
Yeah.
culture, musicians, and we call it pop and policy. So
Hmm.
popular culture and policy. And it was really about leveraging that power to not just mainstream awareness of these issues, but provide a way for people to take action. And it
Mm.
was really rooted in the idea that everyday citizens can change policy. And that became really the genesis of Global Citizen, was to change policy in order to end extreme poverty. And
Mm.
that's really what I've been doing the last 10, 15 years. And so that's really the genesis behind the book, is to help people launch their own campaigns to make a difference.
Yeah, and of course, we're living in a period of time between the environmental movement and policy questions and all the rest of it, where I think, again, from ideas to impact, a playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world, this should be under everybody's arm as they march around trying to change things and maybe learn how to
Thanks.
do it the right way, because I think a lot of the activism these days is not terribly positive and actually sets some movements back a step. And I'm not going to get into, my views on different ways of doing this, because this is yours. Um, one thing I just want to do is mention that when I read your book, it brought to mind somebody else who I've interviewed on my podcast a couple of years ago, who actually is a friend of mine, and that's Matthew Barzun, who
Wow.
was the ambassador to the United Kingdom from the United States for
Wow.
Barack Obama. And before that, the ambassador to Sweden. and also is an independently wealthy entrepreneur himself because he started some tech companies, sold out, and made a lot of money. And he wrote a book called The Power of Giving Away Power. And
Wow.
basically, Matt, in a way, wrote the book, which sort of should be, if I was teaching a course, I would tell people to read both books. Maybe read his first in terms of the philosophical principle of the power of giving away power. And he knows everybody, you know, as you do, by the way. We're going to have to do some name dropping here to let people know how important you are. So we'll talk about some of the heavy hitters you've known, and you're one yourself. But Matt is someone who reached out to me. He had read some of my work. And when he was ambassador to Sweden, he invited me over there just to visit the embassy. I wasn't able to go. I always regret that. It would have been fun to do a state dinner or something. And then later, when he was in London as the ambassador of the United States to the UK, he did something very unusual. He broke all the ambassadorial rules, and instead of doing a lot of official big functions, and this is where your story riffs exactly with his, he decided that what the ambassador from the United States should be doing is reaching directly with no filters to students, and not
Wow.
university students and not Cambridge and Oxford, working class, ordinary British schools. And I won't say public school because, as you know, being a UK, not from the UK, but you know, that's private school in high school, but public school in the American sense of the word. He didn't do a few, he did dozens and dozens and dozens of these. So on any given day, Matt Barzan could be found in a British classroom talking to 12 to 20 to 30 to 100 students, and not lecturing them, but asking them, as the representative of the United States of America, what could we be doing better for you and for the world? And so he had a tremendous interactive relationship, and the British media and everybody got onto this. Well, then he
Wow.
went from that, and he was he designed Barack Obama's fundraising campaign for both presidential runs, raised tens of millions of dollars for him by doing the small donation thing, which he spearheaded. So I'm thinking of Matt because at some point you would
Wow.
need to talk with Matt because he's into what you're doing, in from a different angle. And we can make that introduction. But I'm just telling people that for those of you who understood what the power of giving away power was about, and the title is exactly descriptive, from ideas to impact, a playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world is about, I wouldn't say powerful people, but enabled people sitting up and taking notice and saying, you know, there's a hurting world out there. What can I do? I can't do everything, but what can I do? And I would say, having read this book and just finished it this morning, um, you know, if you want to do something effective, whether it's in the environmental area or racism, you go into South Africa, the apartheid regime, what happened there, you have a lot of sort of anatomy studies of how to change things. This is the book. Let me jump in before we go too far into just talking about all this. And the first thing I want to do is read you something from the prologue, where you quote Gandalf the Wizard from Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. And I knew I liked you the minute I saw this as your quote from the prologue. It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to. And I thought that was a great way to set up your story, because you've certainly been swept off, and also
Mm.
the whole book. And as a Tolkien fan and someone who enjoyed those books immensely over the years and read them all to my children, I like the fact you started your book with that. But anyway, now to go on to something else here. I wanted to read a little bit here from the prologue just to set your book up for you, to my listeners. Despite our divisions, however, there is hope. Worldwide, people from all walks of life demonstrate that systematic change is achievable and flourishing through united voices, cooperation, and solidarity, often hidden from view, but undeniably present. And then just skipping a bit, a significant global population supports bold policy changes for the benefit of our planet and its inhabitants. And then just skipping a bit. In this book, I will demonstrate how we can unite relevant stakeholders, bridge differences, and contribute to implementing the policies needed to address our shared challenges together. By the time you finish reading, you will be able to identify how you can contribute uniquely to the policy process and understand how to transform well-meaning intentions into positive impact. So the prologue sets it up really well. That's the book. Before we go into some more quotes from the book and talk about them, just riff on that a little bit in terms of take us a little further. You mentioned in the book that one way to tell your story and to point all this out is to tell some stories. So why don't you give me some examples of you doing what you're talking about right here in the prologue and how it's worked out, and pick any of the ones you talk about in the book, or maybe ones I don't know about because they're not in the book. But what would jump out if someone said, okay, fine, give me an example of what you're talking about here that you yourself have seen happen because of your or somebody else's activity?
Yeah, well, really appreciate it, Frank, and appreciate just the amount you read, you absorbed, and you reading it back to me. It's really wonderful. And by the way, about the quote from Gandalf, when I was writing the prologue, that just occurred to me. I was a massive Lord of the Rings fan as a kid. And, some of the pitfalls I point out early on in the book, when people start running a campaign, no matter what the issue is, they fall into several traps. One is to focus on the problem innately and just to talk about the problem as if that's going to solve it itself without focused on the solution. The second thing, and I mentioned this in the prologue, is to get hooked on the dopamine high that comes from taking down the other. And I think one of the traits of today's world, when people feel powerless or they lack agency and they feel apathetic, sometimes they channel that by other distractions, right? And this is where I say it's a dangerous business, because one of those distractions can be shaming or policing others, right? And look, when you look at climate change, we're all hypocrites. None of us are perfect, but sometimes we convince ourselves we're making a difference by pointing out the flaws of others, or by policing and getting others to say something so we can go to the pub in the evening, have a beer and say, hey, we got this person to post something on a social media account. And one of the other traits, of course, is people thinking they know all the answers and that they can do everything. And one of the points I make in the book is no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And to go to the opposite side of that, to now look at some of the success stories, whether it was leaders of marginalized communities, whether it was people in business, whether it was everyday citizens, whether it was trade union labor leaders, one of the traits is that they all almost embodied the flip side of all of the different pitfalls I mentioned. They had a very clear grasp of the problem they were trying to solve, but also had a very clear sense of a solution. The second aspect was that they also engaged in pragmatic idealism. So they recognized creating change involved engaging with people who you may not always like or agree with 100%. And the final point was they recognized how to leverage the strengths of others, right? And just to give you a very clear, concrete example, okay, you wanted name dropping. 2018.
Drop a name in, impress us.
2018, 6 years ago, we were invited, this is Global Citizen, to come to South Africa to do a campaign, an event to mark what would have been the 100-year centenary of the birth of Nelson Mandela, right? And we managed to bring Beyonce, Jay-Z, Ed Sheeran, Oprah Winfrey, Bob Geldof, all of these big names in the world. Hopefully they're big enough for you in terms of names drop. And we announced this campaign in July 2018, and 3 handles were trending, or 3 hashtags were trending. The first was Mandela 100. The second was Beyonce, of course. Everyone was going crazy that we were bringing her out to South Africa for this occasion. The third issue was called It's Bloody Time. And I looked into where this hashtag was coming from, and it was from these phenomenal young woman advocates who had basically launched a campaign, very clear sense. They said, look, in South Africa, there's a problem. Girls drop out of school when they hit puberty and they can't afford period products, whether that's tampons or sanitary pads and napkins. And it was pointed out to me by these advocates that some girls lose up to 60 days a year from education because they lack access to sanitary pads and napkins or period products. And their view was, you could make this more accessible through two ways. By removing it from the tax code, because in many countries in the world, these products are taxed as luxury goods. And not just to remove the tax on these goods, but to actually make them accessible in particularly schools in lower income neighborhoods
Sure.
across the country of South Africa, right? The second thing is that they were willing to reach out and engage. And one point I often say to young advocates who reach out to me, don't think you have to reinvent the wheel. Don't think you have to create an event over here or build your own organization. Go out and ask others to use their platform, because they might be happy, to your point on Matt's book, giving away power, they might be happy to give you a voice. And in this, they reached out to us and they said, would you be a platform to leverage and to raise traction on this campaign? And in this, we were happy, I guess, to be leveraged. So these women, I remember it was in Galhouseman, this shouldn't be the key issue. But you know what? Several months, this popular campaign we had run in the country, millions of people took action. Hundreds of thousands of people sent in tweets, emails, phone calls. This really resonated. I still remember when we walked in to see one of the government ministers in the parliament in Cape Town, the whole table rocked when they put this petition on the table. And then I remember at this event, long story short, and it was full of drama, like right up to the moment Oprah Winfrey was introducing the president before Jay-Z and Beyonce took the stage, 100,000 people in FNB Stadium, which was incredible. I mean, it's where they did the FIFA World Cup final in 2010. It almost didn't happen. And I still remember the president announcing he had heard this call and would address the needs of the Guild Chard and provide sanitary dignity and address period poverty throughout the country. And you know what? It was the tenacity, the ongoing efforts of these advocates working together, including government, that have meant that since that announcement, 4 million girls have now accessed sanitary pads, sanitary napkins. And by the way, that's 4 million girls that may not have had to drop out of school as a result and lose 60 days of education. And that came from these savvy advocates willing to work, willing to look at others, and willing to make the ask.
And work with you. Yeah, I'm so glad you chose that example. That's terrific. Thank you. And I am going to just move on a little further into the book on page 33 here. I wanted to give a context to everything you're doing and what I think must be the most perennial problem you now face across the planet, but certainly here in the United States. And this paragraph sort of sums it up. And I wrote a little note here. You can see my scribbles on the book. This is where we are. And here's what you say. In times of hyperpolarization, individuals in positions of influence are under tremendous pressure to emphasize their loyalty to a particular side of the ropes to fit in and be identified with one specific partisan group. Demonstrating support for the other side of the rope leads to cries of betrayal and harsh political consequences. And so we have these kind of hardened absolutists politically and or religiously and or culturally and or racially and or ethnically and or gender defined identity positions. By the time you're done with all that, how does your organization, how does, Michael Sheldrick himself working with all these people, but also just on the ground, put it together? Because it seems that, there's almost no area where you can say anything where it hasn't been politicized or someone has not claimed this issue as their own. I mean, we even get into this in the arts, in that I'm a novelist, I'm a writer, and increasingly you hear from the sort of sensitivity readers, but you're a white male, how do you write a woman's voice? And, at a certain point you're saying to yourself, well, wait a minute, literature is, and art is imagination of trying to imagine you are the other person. I mean, you're a white male and you're raising hundreds of millions of pounds or dollars or something for an issue in South Africa to help young Black women finish school. If we did it all based on gender divisions in politics, you understand what I'm talking about. So I would imagine
absolutely.
The context of everything you're doing must be affected by this kind of divisive spirit of absolutism, of identifying whose side are you on. I'm not going to, answer your question for you, but I'm interested if I've hit it on the head in terms of just a big issue.
100%. And look, there are many examples of where I've seen leaders who have navigated those divides, who have had the courage. I in the book, I share some of the stories of the campaigners involved in the Inflation Reduction Act. And if you want an example of a movement that's torn itself apart and missed opportunity after opportunity over the last 30 years, it's the environmental movement, right? And yet, I was
Yeah.
speaking to this one guy who was involved in building the consensus to get the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and he literally said, not only do we have retreats, we had sleepovers, and we brought together those who were on the crazy, like he said, lefty side, and those who were so conservative they wouldn't even mention the words climate change. There's obviously other leaders, like I talk about Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, who's literally trying to build those bridges over those divisions. But in terms of my experience, right, often I found the true north when you're navigating those situations and you're wondering, what do I do? And it feels like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. How do I stick my neck out here? Is to actually ask communities impacted. And we don't do that enough, because what's interesting, Frank, you just shared that someone will criticize you for trying to write and imagine a woman's voice in a particular situation, right? That empathy, right? And they're assuming that they know, like the exact woman you're writing in the exact context you're writing. Sure. They're assuming that they speak for all women in that situation, right? And often I find that people hurtling criticism make assumptions which aren't even true. And to give you a couple of examples of where I've seen this borne out a lot. One example, I mean, I mentioned I had just come from Ghana, right?
Yeah.
And I talk about this in the book, about a situation 2 years ago when we were doing this big campaign in Ghana. We were bringing this big event. We were bringing Usher. At the time, a bill was going through the parliament that would ban homosexuality across the country. Not just ban it, but actually criminalize advocacy on the issue. So even to advocate for LGBTQ rights was illegal. And we got calls, should we boycott the country? Should we withdraw? And a lot of these calls were coming from well-meaning advocates in the global north, in America, in Britain. They said, that's outrageous. And so in the end, I thought, well, what am I going to do here? I don't want to further marginalize people, but also I don't want to make hasty decisions that might inadvertently be counterproductive and actually lead to this bill being passed, right? And because I was also aware of who I was as a Westerner, I didn't want it to be like, okay, you're coming in and preaching and we're going to use that against you. And so I went out and I actually spoke to some of the NGOs representing those communities. And I spoke to colleagues who had those conversations, and they made two observations. The first thing they said is, it's interesting that you're weighing up, do you boycott or do you engage? And that was never a serious prospect, but they just thought it was interesting people were asking us to do that, because the point they made is, does that mean that global citizen, because you campaign on sexual reproductive health and rights, does that mean you're never doing an event in America now since Roe versus Wade was overturned, right? So don't assume because a government's talking about one thing, or not even a government, a few elected officials, that it speaks for a whole population. The second point they made was, you coming in boycotting and not having any engagement, that would be one of the worst things. Because you would give fodder to those who just believe LGBTQ rights are Western human rights. And basically you would fast track it. And they said, listen, the best way you can help us, honestly, in this situation is by giving us a platform, giving us a voice, making us visible, but letting us tell that story, right, on our platform. And that's what we did. We didn't attempt to speak for them. And anyone that came to us and said, oh, well, why are you activating in this country? That's exactly what I told them, and had those conversations. And I don't think we do that enough, to actually go to communities and say, well, how can I help you? How can I best share those stories? And often I find people want the help, and they love the fact that they stand in solidarity. Another example, just very quickly, Kenya and the media and hosting group be boycott and up to sign on. And I said, well, let's actually speak to young people in Kenya. What do they want? And I got one of these young campaigners on the phone from Kenya, and he told colleagues and other partners,
Mm.
he said, that's the worst thing. Don't boycott. That's the worst thing. And I
Yeah,
think many impacted communities actually understand that you can't apply a binary bias or a purity test to their
sure.
work. They understand that making a difference is shades of gray more than anyone. And so
Mm-mm.
my advice is, if you're in that conundrum, how do I make a difference? People are telling me not to say one thing, to do this. Go and speak to the communities who are actually impacted.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Let me reintroduce you here. If you are listening to and or watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, it goes off as a YouTube live event and a few other places live, and then goes to podcasts wherever they're found. My guest today is policy entrepreneur, author, and co-founder of Global Citizen, Michael Sheldrick. Michael is also the author of a new book, From Ideas to Impact, a playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world. And I, at the beginning, was showing Michael that not only have I read it, but it is thumbed well, scribbled all over, which is the way you honor a book, at least a
Thank
nonfiction
you.
book.
Thank
Let
you.
me read something that I think it brings up the next little bit that I want to talk about. This is, I think, page 71 in your step 8, communicate stories of success. Real stories give us hope. They show us that our actions matter. When you've translated a commitment into tangible impact, share that story with your networks. Inspiring others to believe in the potential for change is crucial for driving progress and countering disillusionment in the state of democracy and global solidarity. And there's a couple of things there I'd like you to delve into. Um, the word disillusionment jumps out because I think we feel disillusioned about so much these days. Part of that is because there's a lot to be disillusioned about. It also seems to me, as someone who's now 72 and been around before social media, that some of that disillusionment is simply because so many things are thrown at us. It isn't that actually anything is worse or better. It's just that we're getting all these little bits of information which are upsetting. And it used to be that you got a newspaper thrown on your lawn, you read the daily news, it had already gone through an editorial process that weeded out things. You weren't
Yeah.
overwhelmed all the time. So I don't think some of this is real, but I think some of the disillusionment is real. So I'd like you to speak to that aspect in terms of motivating people to do anything against this backdrop of disillusionment and despair, up into the point where, at least in Western cultures, developed cultures, so to speak, we have these massive epidemics, pandemics of depression and teen suicide and self-harming and a sense of powerlessness, people stuck on their mobile phones, earbuds plugged in, less eye contact, less community. In this environment, writing a book called From Ideas to Impact, a playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world, if you picture someone sitting there staring at their feet, or playing a video game on their phone, plugged in earbuds so they won't hear you if you say hello and they happen to be walking by, this is a
Yeah.
tough context in which to get anybody to do anything. And I wonder if you can address that, because obviously you work with younger people across the planet. So you must have some sense of where their heads are at.
Yeah, so I would say several things on that. The first is, the reason why I make this a principle in of itself is because the research shows that, especially when we don't trust what's coming at us from the media or the social media, when we look at our friends and family, one of the best ways to motivate someone to take an action is when they see other people taking action and they see the impact of the results and they hear about that. That's by far one of the best things we can do. And another author, Catherine Hayhoe, who wrote a book called Saving Us, which is about climate change and how to have conversations. She makes the point that rather than shaming people, if you're taking meaningful action in your own life, sharing that with others can be one of the best, most powerful sources of spurring others to act. I would say the second point I would make, and this is really a reflection on those of us with platforms, we spend a lot of time reinforcing the despair. We spend a lot of time reinforcing disillusionment by the stories we tell or the actions we ask people to take. And I've seen this from my own work at Global Citizen, right? In the book, I cite a study from NYU. It looked at 60,000 people across 60 countries. And sure enough, if you want to maximize engagement on social media, the one action you should ask people to take is to share a story about how bad the world is doing.
Yeah.
By and far, that will get you most engagement, right?
Yeah.
But if you want to instill in people a belief that their actions can make a difference, right? One of the actions to ask people isn't to share a bad story on social media. It's actually to sit down, say with respect to climate change, sit down and write a letter to a future, can be a hypothetical kid, it can be a real kid, but a future family member, hypothetical or real, who will be alive in 2055 and living with the consequences we're fighting today, and the actions we're taking today. And in that letter, spell out to this future generation member all of the actions you are doing right now within your control to combat climate change. And people who did that, right, when they walked away, the act of writing that letter, it left them with a far greater belief that their actions can make a difference, that there's something for them to do. And the reason I say that is a lot of influencers on social media, right? We're telling people to take the wrong action. We're telling people to spread more of the bad news. And this leads me to my third point. The truth is, we actually have more capacity as individuals than at any previous point in time to actually make a difference. We have far greater tools. And at the end of my book, I share a story. As I finished writing the book, and I was submitting the manuscript, my mum in Australia gave me a call. And she said, there's a gentleman who's just checked in who you might remember. And she said, this guy's Len. And I immediately said to her, Len, you mean the older gentleman who lived at the bottom of the street? I would get home from school, I would walk my dog. And there was Len. He had 2 walking sticks. He had this dog, wiry gray hair. Literally, the dog was called Tramp, and it looked like the dog from Lady and the Tramp. And I would talk to him about war stories, etc. Mum said, yes, that guy. And I said, well, how old is he? He was like, must have been in his 80s. And that was almost 20 years ago. She said, he's now 105 years old.
Wow.
And so that night, I found myself, Mum put him on FaceTime, and I was FaceTiming Len. And he told me this story. He said he was born in 1917. He got married in 1939. This was in UK, England, shortly after the break of the war in Europe when Germany was invading France. He found himself in France, isolated as the Germans overran. And he recorded running up this hill at one point. He was running up the hill and a shadow came over him. And he looked up and he saw 200 German planes flying above him. Thought he was gone. He thought that was over, but fortunately they didn't see him because he was one person. He ran around the hill, found this abandoned American car. He said, "You beaut." Got in this car. He drove to the coast, somehow managed to get on the last boat leaving France before it fell to the German war machine, made it to England, and his superior officer said, go to this town and defend the community. You're the only one there. You have to mobilize the villagers. So he goes to this town. Literally, German parachuters are jumping out in the skies above, rallies the villagers, pitchforks and all. They go down to meet them. And I said to Len, I said, how did you have hope? Did you think it was over? Like, how did you not lose yourself to despair? And he said to me, he said, no. We looked at each other and we said, we haven't got much, but we're not running away. We'll give it a go.
Yeah.
We're not running away. We'll give it a go. And I think, you know, and he, a few weeks after I submitted the manuscript, by the way, he turned 106. His daughter came in and he said, you know, I've given it all. It's up to others to give it a go. And he passed away that evening. And I think now, you know, my book is in an attempt to give people all of the answers, doesn't profess to have everything, but it is aimed for those people just looking for a start. The best way to begin is to begin, because change starts with us. And we have far more than what Len had 80 or so years ago. And it was pointed out to me by someone else that people alive today, we perhaps living in this moment in time where the actions we take today as individuals will have far greater impact on the future lives of people in 5, 10, 15 years time than any previous generation of humanity. And so we have a profound opportunity to make the biggest difference if we choose to make it. And I'm seeing it again and again, and those stories are out there. Those stories are happening. We just have to remember to not lose ourselves in despair. We have to jolt ourselves out of that, and that's where
and remind ourselves
stories of
what you
impact
said
are
earlier,
important.
which was that the way to get the clicks sometimes is the bad news, and we have to understand that's what's going on. So
Exactly.
we are being manipulated by the algorithms as well, because
Exactly.
they know what's going to get our attention. That's a lovely story. Let me just say we are talking to Michael Sheldrick, from Ideas to Impact, a playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world. There's the book. I have notes throughout. And I'll just remind people that this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts so that you can hear this and other podcasts. And to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, where I make commentaries on various subjects. And we'll be talking about this book a little bit on my It Has to Be Said
Thank you.
statement little thing as well. Let me just jump ahead here and say a little intermission from what we're talking about. I just ran into something here when you were talking about community that jumped out in a weird context, kind of along with your Tolkien quote. And you were quoting Sarah Stanley, local colleague, community leader, and she says, "I'd love us to be known as more than a coal mining town. We are very proud of our roots. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not all we are." The context for that is that I am a fan of and have been watching Welcome to Wrexham, which is this documentary series about a small Welsh town that two millionaire American actors have bought the local football club. And they've made a huge go of it. And basically, I happened to be in a British boys boarding school up in North Wales, very near Wrexham. And so I know the area, but there's a town that was in absolute despair. And the only little shred of public life they had left in Wrexham, and this is a very popular documentary series on television. It's in its third season now. It's popular for a reason, and it actually ties in well with your book. And that is that all this little town had, a defunct coal mining town, really down at the heel, empty shops, nothing going on, was this one little soccer, as Americans call it, football club that the town grimly hung on to and financed themselves. And these two American actors, who between them have hundreds of millions of dollars, found out about it and took a fancy to this, and about 5 years ago started getting ready to buy the club, and they have, and now they're in the third season of the documentary. But what is interesting to me is why the documentary is so successful is nothing to do with football. It's because of the fact that someone cared enough to come in and do something that was positive and gave everybody in that little town hope and brought them together as a community. And I think it's a wonderful kind of parallel to what you talk about in your book in so many stories. I know that's way off the subject, but
no, I love that. I love that.
It really, if you and your wife want to kick back sometime and just really enjoy something, watch Welcome to Wrexham. Let me read this from page 123 of your book that people really do have to read if they want to ever change anything in this life or actually do anything, because it's kind of a handbook on how you get up in the morning and make changes in any kind of area you're interested in, not to mention the activism you're talking about, from the environment to racism to relationships and so forth. I can't recommend the book highly enough. In many parts of the world, just transitions face backlash. Sometimes it's due to entrenched interests or fundamental disagreements about the necessity of transitioning to clean energy. However, more often than not, it's because of poor implementation. To reiterate McCartney's words, quote, "It doesn't work because it's not just," end quote. Instead of fostering collaboration, finding common ground, and embracing what is both inevitable and possible, division and complacency take hold. Many simply do not begin early enough. Most critically, transitions often fail to genuinely involve affected communities and give them a meaningful role in the process. The government tries to own it instead. And I think that your book is kind of an appeal to people to, first of all, put aside some divisions for the greater good, which sounds a little preachy, but it's absolutely necessary. You can't hate the people you're working with, and if you
Yeah.
won't work with anybody except those who agree with you and that you like, you're not going to work with anybody. By the way, as somebody who's been married for 52 years,
Wow.
3 years, that's the way you make marriages work too, or parenting or grandparenting, all of which I've done a lot of. And it's not by emphasizing your divisions. It is by putting them aside and saying, well, wait a minute, we have children. Let's make this work for them during, say, a bad patch, getting through it, going on. It's the same principle and everything. But what I want you to concentrate on here, and maybe tell us some stories again that illustrate the point, is both the most critically, transitions often fail to genuinely involve affected communities and give them a meaningful role. Now, you already told a wonderful story of the young women in South Africa who banded together and said it's about bloody time, and how you involved them. And I know you've done other things like that, and give you a chance to name drop a little more if you want. But tell us some other stories that will inspire us. I'm going to be very specific here, to bridge differences with people we don't like or approve of, who may be voting for different people than we like. But on this, whatever this is, we can agree. Because it seems to me we've all got to find what this is, or we're not going to get anything done on any of these issues because we're too divided. It's 50-50 all the way down the line on so many things. What are some things that we could say, hey, I hate your guts, but on this, I'll work with you? Give us an example of where that's happened anywhere in the world, whether it's Northern Ireland in the peace process or something less newsworthy just on a local level. Give us some hope that that can work. Hey, we can agree on this. I don't like you, and I'm going to vote for a different guy, but we can work on this. That has to be what we need to reach for on so many fronts. At least that's what I take from your book.
No, well, I really love that, Frank. And by the way, I'm going to check out that show you mentioned in North Wales. It sounds really great. And by the way, Wales itself has become a little bit of a social experiment or laboratory for many interesting policies. They also appointed the first ever commissioner of future generations, which means that any policy or law that they're looking to pass or implement in Wales, they have to take into account the perspectives of future generations not yet born, right? So it's a fascinating place. But I want to stick on that word community because someone pointed out to me the other day, and this wasn't intentional, like I'd never explicitly say this in the book, but someone said, one of the through lines throughout the entire book is the word community. And I thought it was interesting that that's a word you latched on as well. And if we just stay with, since we've been talking about coal mines, and coal plants and coal communities, and finding common ground around one thing. I actually think the story I tell in the book from Western Australia, which is where I'm from, is insightful in that regard. So when I was writing this book, I was acutely aware that if we're to address issues like climate change, we have to, of course, shift our energy systems away from fossil fuels. Everyone knows that, right? The challenge is often in these debates, people say, well, okay, is action on climate change, is it a zero-sum game? And is it going to come at the expense of people's livelihoods, coal workers in West Virginia? You see this around the world, and this is why climate change becomes so contentious, because it's seen as a zero-sum game. And so I looked around for an example of one place where they were getting this right, or at least had some ingredients for what was the secret sauce here to get this right. And I landed on this town of Collie, Western Australia, and I went there. And it's a town which is, probably a 100-year-old coal-reliant community. In fact, more. I would say more than a quarter of the jobs in this town are reliant directly on the coal industry, and the other jobs and industries are somehow related to it. And many of the families there are third, fourth generation coal families, right? And it was interesting because in many parts of the world, often you have this debate between environmentalists and local union leaders or local workers. They butt heads, right? And sure enough, that's how this one story began. I went and met with one of the union leaders and who was involved in this process since the start. And he had this epiphany moment actually in 2007. He was watching Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, and he said, my God, if we don't get ahead of this, everyone's taking action on climate change, our town's going to be finished. There's going to be no demand for coal. And we're going to be, not only are we not going to have any jobs in this town, right? But the town itself will be finished. We have to move somewhere else. And so he describes this moment where they have this town hall. Everyone's gathered together, right? And he says, we have to start planning for a post-coal world. And you can imagine how that went down, like a lead balloon. The audience was silent. And then suddenly someone gets up and they say, oh, Steve, you don't know the first thing about this community. He said, when a baby is born here, they get two things. The first is they get their mother's milk, and the second is a lump of coal in their hand. We're not going anywhere. We're not changing from coal. And then they all started yelling abuse at him. When he walked out the hall, they all parted like a fish. So he walked out. And then he said 5 years later, when the government suddenly started saying, oh, maybe coal's not feasible anymore economically, he said, the community welcomed me back like I was Nostradamus, right?
Yeah,
and so from that point onwards, right, you get to the end of the story, almost a decade later. Steve, this union leader, is explaining this to me. There he is at the back of a workers' meeting. The governor of the state is there, and he's announcing that the remaining coal plants will close in the next few years. Again, silent. And then suddenly one worker starts to clap, and the whole audience breaks out into applause, right? And the reason why they embraced that closure, the reason why they weren't yelling, and this was over a course of 15 years, is because alongside that, millions of dollars had been invested in new businesses. They were constructing the largest battery storage system in the Southern Hemisphere, constructing new jobs. And the reason how this all came together was because environmentalists, climate negotiators, turned environmentalists, turned unionists, they all got together, and campaigners that used to protest the coal plants and vice versa, they got together and they started having conversations. And for those coal workers, in many cases, it was the first time they actually spoke to an environmentalist. With the environmentalist, it was the first time they bothered to ask. And they recognized, yeah, you know what? Me saying, don't worry, you can get a job. We're investing in a coffee shop over here, which is maybe a third of the salary you're currently getting, when many of these coal workers pride themselves as energy workers. And where there was the overlap, if you drew a Venn diagram and you saw the part that overlapped, there was a poignant moment, which I describe in the book, where they had this discussion and they said, you don't get it. This is not about our jobs. This is about our home. And as soon as they had that conversation, everyone got it, the value of home, because everyone could relate into that, where you were coming from. And environmental campaigners and the coal workers made common cause in advocating for investment in renewable and clean energy, in battery storage, when they came together.
When they talked
and
to
it
each
was
other.
Exactly. And they identified that common value, which was about home, which was about community, which transcended politics.
Yeah, I'm going to replug your book here. I'm talking to Michael, who is the author of From Ideas to Impact, a playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world. And I'm Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation With. Please subscribe to my Substack thingam, whatever, and all those good things. Let me just do another little quote here. You say an effective policy entrepreneur identifies their leverage point and quickly discerns how to complement their approach through partnership. Well, the story you just told kind of makes that point. And that's what we just talked about. But it brings me to, it's a good segue to what I wanted to go into next here. And This is from your, let me see what chapter is this, conclusion being part of the solution in a world on fire. There is a stark difference between my unwavering belief in the potential for change and the often disappointing reality. It's a recognition that two things can be true simultaneously. Many people worldwide still maintain an enduring and resilient faith in the promise of democratic governance and international institutions such as the UN. Such faith persists even as people harbor concerns about their current performance. We already talked a little bit about the loss of faith and the kind of despair. I think another thing you need to address that you kind of address in the book by telling the stories you do is a level of cynicism that cuts across all parties. You know, we have two candidates for president that are old, and people feel one, I happen to be one, is a criminal and should never have been elected in the first place and always has been a con artist. The other is definitely getting older. We live in troubled times. We're in the middle of Russia attacking Ukraine and a huge war in the Middle East. Not only is there a sense of powerlessness, but there is a cynicism. Just take, for instance, one type of story that breaks again and again and again, and that is, you know, many of our tech billionaires seem very disconnected from what actually happens as a result of their products. For instance, one of the first things that happened with AI that makes the news is these fake videos taking a teenage high school girl, using her portrait that some boy or other person hijacks, and then all of a sudden, you know, it's welded on with a porn star or someone doing something that she would never do. There's no recourse. The tech bros seem totally disinterested in doing anything about what you would call the collateral damage, which just exponentially increases from their footprint. That's the climate in which you're asking people to be involved. And you, and this, I don't want to put you in a hard place, but you, Michael Sheldrick, are raising money a lot of times or dealing with the very elites who seem to me, as an observer, to be pretty irresponsible when it comes to the use of their power and often in what they don't care about. So when you look at the final fallout from Facebook or all the other products that Meta's involved with, or what Elon Musk is doing, or AI as it's now being kind of used without having thought it through. You know, Scarlett Johansson has her voice stolen or imitated and it's denied, and then there it is. You know, this is the world we're living in. The guys you're trying to raise money from, you know, the old railroad barons, you know, were simple to deal with by comparison. They built railroads, they polluted the thing. Then they built wonderful museums, like the Metropolitan Gallery of Art of New York. We knew what they did. They littered the world with libraries and cultural artifacts. They had a sense of public responsibility, even if they were, you know, not such good people themselves. But we're into a generation of entrepreneurs because you're labeled as an entrepreneur, and their entrepreneurial efforts have seemed so selfish and so blinded by, you know, building your own rocket ship, whatever it may be, anything but taking responsibility for your product and what it is doing to people. And I just think your book, if I can be so bold, the idealism of your book, From Ideas to Impact, is on a collision course with the cynicism of a lot of the wealthiest people on this planet right now. And I just wonder how you react to that.
No, I think it's a good question. And one thing I address head on in the book, and I actually have a whole section for advice to philanthropy on what they should be doing better. But one point I address head on is the idea of what I would say the technological optimist, because also that cynicism which you were mentioning about, you know, tech billionaires in the world, they would also have you believe that they are the world's saviors, right? That technology alone is going to address all of our issues if we allow it to go unfettered. And one thing that I will say, and I've written on this recently, is I think there is a distinction between, say, ethics and AI that serves a beneficial purpose for society.
Yeah.
And just to put a fine point on that, you know, a product can be ethically made, right? But it doesn't mean it's going to be used beneficially for society. and all the stuff you're talking about with AI, its uses, privacy, these are things that will be worked out, right? In the same way that vaccines, right, to be used, they have to be FDA certified.
Sure,
They have
sure.
to be approved by the World Health Organization. That's all the ethics involved. That's ensuring something's ethically produced. But it's much harder to say, well, how do you make sure these technologies are beneficial for society? Just because vaccines or drugs or medical healthcare is ethically produced doesn't mean that they're going to be made available to the masses of society, right? Doesn't mean that they're going to be equitably distributed, as we saw during the pandemic when they were hoarded by a particular group. And so the real question is, how do you make sure technology is beneficial to society? And that's where policy comes in. And that's why you need policy entrepreneurs.
Sure.
And my appeal to philanthropy in the book is, if you're serious, because some of them have started to talk about systemic change. Some of them have said we need system change. If you're serious, don't try and do that yourself. Invest in the advocates, the entrepreneurs who know how to do that. Invest in their capacity, who are advocating for change. They're the policy entrepreneurs. Give them the platform so that we can actually make sure that these technologies, in many cases, created by these people, as you said, who are then giving away billions of dollars, to make sure it benefits society as a whole. And I think, what are some of the kind of policies? Like, it's not lost on me. We spoke about the robber barons of the late 19th century and the Gilded Age.
Sure.
Ultimately, it was policies by leaders like Theodore Roosevelt, who I actually speak about in the conclusion, living here in New York City. But many of that actually came from the policies he came in, antitrust laws, policies to actually, ensure that even people in New York, living in the tenements, had a better standard of living. And you've seen that throughout. My fine point on that today is, we don't have to wait for presidents alone to be able to promote policy. Back 100 years ago, or more than 100 years ago, with Theodore Roosevelt, there was only a few thousand people in the whole of America who could probably influence his decisions. And I think the big question for philanthropy is, are they going to invest in the capacity of everyday citizens? And in the book, I propose some ways to do that. On Friday, when I was in London, I had some discussions with folks looking at different forms of democracy, things like global citizen assemblies, ways to give people a say in the decision making to actually move this along. And I guess where I still get my optimism from and hope is, last year, I was grappling. People say to me, well, what's an idea you're grappling with right now? It's from ideas to impact. Last year, we sought to have a look at the idea of global solidarity itself, where we partnered with a think tank to measure global solidarity. And what we found is, when you look at institutions, when you look at impacts, yes, we're in the danger zone. But the reason why we're not at breaking point right now is because of where people is at, the popular pulse of people. And there's still majorities, even if it's faltering majorities in countries like America, that identify as global citizens, that believe in the kind of bold ideas that we urgently need to address the big challenges facing us. And I think philanthropy could play a huge role by investing in the capacity of policy entrepreneurs amongst people writ large to be able to address these big challenges. And that's my appeal to philanthropy. And I've been having that conversation again and again, because the data supports it when you look at where people is at. That's where I get my optimism from.
Yeah, and we're going to wrap this up now, but it's a good segue into an idea that my producer, Ernie Gregg, texted me during the conversation that I want to bring up. And that is, I had talked about your book in the context of Matt Barzan's book, The Power of Giving Away Power. I think, if Ernie can swing it, I'd like to get you back and Matt and have a discussion with the three of us about both of your books, but also the relationship of your work to his and his work to yours, because he put together this massive fundraising campaign for Barack Obama, then became ambassador to the UK, working with, I'm sure, people you both know. You share the same cell phone numbers, probably, with the kind of movers and shakers you deal with. But I really think that his title, The Power of Giving Away Power, is part of this formula. And you've just been talking about it with the philanthropy on a scale that could be scaled up to do some of the things you're talking about, as long as that money is not being spent by the person themselves who earned it, but working with people who are actually face to face with those who are being impacted, like your young women in South Africa who needed period products. So let me just finish by reading something here that's a nice place, I think, to wrap this up. While the tools and levers of policy entrepreneurship were traditionally reserved for those in positions of power, often rendered invisible to most of society, today they are accessible to all of us in the sunlight, with the sunlight. So I love that idea of transparency and using some of these tech tools that I'm not particularly fond of, although we're using one right now to talk to people, which is always odd to be railing on tech bros who invented the technology we're now talking on. Hypocrisy aside. So I would like to just again tell people that if you want to do anything, whether it's in environmentalism or race relations or anything, from ideas to impact is a handbook. It literally tells you how to do this, with stories as well of how that has been affected. And Michael, we will link to anything you want us to link to in terms of putting people in touch with you who will be watching this or
Thank you.
listening to it. Ernie's very good at that. We will be back in touch with you about hopefully doing a talk with you and Matt Barzan, who raised all the money for Barack Obama's presidential runs, and also was an ambassador and had the experience of turning his ambassadorial role in the UK, which is our biggest ambassadorial appointment, into a real thing, not just state dinners, but sitting down in the British public school system and talking with ordinary working class and middle class students about their concerns about America and the world. And he's such an interesting guy, and I'd love you to know him.
I would
You
love
two
it.
are meant to talk sometime. Maybe the first place we can do that is right here on In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. So listen, thank you for being here, and
Thanks,
please
Frank.
subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, it has to be said, at Frank Schaeffer, substack.com. And anything you want to add, Michael, before we wrap up?
No, I would just say I love this. Thank you for providing the platform. I'll finish with a quote from one of my heroes, Eleanor Roosevelt, who of course co-wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She said, "The best way to begin is to begin." And so thank you, Frank, for kicking off this conversation. Really appreciate it.
Good. And I really hope the book does well. A lot of people need to read this. So any way we can help you spread the word, just let Ernie and me know, and we'll get right out there. So
Thank you, Frank.
all the best to you and to your 6-month-old daughter and to your wife and all your travels and safe journeys, and come talk to us again.
Thank you. Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you. Okay.